Senator John Cornyn, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. As you know, the mask mandate seems to be dead for public transportation after a judge ruled against it yesterday. TSA now says they're not even enforcing it. And so I'm wondering what your thought is about that. And when you look at the judge's ruling yesterday, the judge questioned whether CDC even had that authority. Does there need to be a law change to make it more specific?
Well, I, for one, am celebrating not having to wear a mask on public transportation. As you know, the guidance has been inconsistent and some would say contradictory. You look, for example, at what's happening at the southern border. Tens of thousands of people are coming across. We don't know whether they've been vaccinated, whether they've been tested, and certainly they're not wearing masks, and they're being bussed into the United States, where those of us who've been vaccinated, boosted, and are taking the appropriate protocols are told, you have to wear a mask. Now, to be clear, if people want to wear masks, they ought to be free to do so. But I think there's no demonstrated justification, in my opinion, for continuing to require that as a mandate.
Do you think there needs to be a law change because the judge really nailed down and said CDC really, she didn't think had the authority to impose this? So does Congress need to act, do you think, to make it more clear?
Well, we'll certainly study the judge's opinion. I read this morning that the Department of Justice was deciding whether to appeal or not, but it seems to me that enough time has passed and conditions have changed and improved enough that I think most people feel like the compulsory mask requirement is no longer justified. Now, whether it could be at some future point, then that's another question, but I, for one, am celebrating.
You mentioned the border, and the latest numbers from Border Patrol show since the fiscal year began last October through March, there have been more than 1 million encounters at the southern border. And so, and now Title 42 is going to be ending. How concerned are you about this, and what can be done? What should Congress do about this?
Well, even before the Biden administration was sworn into office on January the 20th, 2021, the Border Patrol had told me in my visits that if they lost Title 42 as a means to control at least some of what's coming across the border, mainly adult males, they would lose control entirely. As you know, most people who are coming across now are claiming asylum. This is a legal requirement of credible fear of persecution in your home country. But the Biden administration appears to just be waving people on through, giving them a notice to appear at a future court date, maybe years in the future, and it's no surprise to anybody that there's a lot of no-shows. So the message has really not been one of deterrence or discouraging people from coming to the United States en masse. It's been encouragement. And I would just say, Jack, one of the aspects of that worries me the most is that the criminal organizations who are getting rich smuggling people into the United States, these are the same criminal organizations that smuggle drugs. And what the Border Patrol, again, the experts tell me, is that they've had many of their Border Patrol have to leave the front lines to go do the paperwork, handle unaccompanied children and things of that nature. And so the drug cartels have had carte blanche in be able to bring the drugs across the border. Last year we lost 100,000 Americans due to drug overdoses, most of which came across the southern border, including synthetic opioids. The precursors come from China. This is assembled, manufactured in Mexico, and brought in the United States. So I have no explanation, no understanding of why the Biden administration doesn't consider this to be a problem. But I can guarantee you most Texans believe it's a problem and think the federal government needs to step up and do something about it.
Title 42, though, was never meant to be a long-term solution, right? So, I mean, given the fact that COVID doesn't seem to be as bad, it's going to come to an end at some point. So what has to be done to prevent what you said was losing control of the border?
That's a fair point. Title 42 wasn't meant to be primarily an immigration control mechanism, but what needs to happen is there needs to be a plan for what happens when it does go away, whatever that date is. And so far, we've been getting nothing but crickets when we ask the administration, what's your plan? One thing they could do is use authority they already have called expedited removal, and to basically remove people when they come across who are not claiming asylum and who have no legal authority to be in the United States. And this would provide some measure of deterrence. If people are paying thousands of dollars, which they are, to come from their home country into the United States, but they end up being removed on an expedited basis, then that will eventually provide some deterrence. That's been the case we've seen demonstrated in the past in previous administrations, but a catch and release policy, which is what the Biden administration's policy is, does nothing but encourage more people to come.
As you know, Governor Abbott made a lot of headlines in the last couple of weeks with his policies with regards to, at the border, the truck and more inspections, which he then backed off after getting agreements with the various governors along the border in Mexico, and then busing those willing to be bused up to Washington, D.C. What's your thought on both of those things?
Well, I understand Governor Abbott's frustration. This is not a state problem, but it is the Texas problem because we have 1,200 miles of common border with Mexico. But I can imagine his frustration at having the Biden administration do nothing to help make things better. And indeed, as I said, they've done nothing but make things worse. So there are not a lot of tools available to the governor. And I don't blame him for trying some of these. None of them are a perfect fit, because the real perfect fit would be for the Biden administration to enforce current laws. And then this problem wouldn't be as bad as what it is right now.
But what about members of Congress? I mean, nothing happens, nothing changes. We go from administration to administration, and nothing gets done in the Congress.
Well, I reached out to my colleague, border state senator from Arizona, Senator Sinema. We introduced well over a year ago a bill called the Bipartisan Border Solutions Act, together with Tony Gonzalez, a Republican from a border district, and Henry Cuellar from Laredo. So we had a bipartisan, bicameral bill that it wasn't perfect, but would have made things better, would have provided some response to this humanitarian and public health crisis at the border. I thought that if the president's poll numbers got bad enough that he would reach out and say, well, I'll take that lifeline and we'll work with you. We've heard zero from the administration on their desire to change anything about the crisis that's occurring at the border. It's really shocking.
Inflation. What can be done about it, either in Congress, or what do you think the solution is?
Well, part of the problem is just spending. Now, during the pandemic, we had to do extraordinary things that I never dreamed we would need to do in terms of addressing the public health and the economic losses associated with the mitigation measures. By and large, this was sort of the equivalent of a world war in terms of the expenditure. We didn't ask in World War II, how much does it cost to defeat Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany? We did what we had to do, and then we figured it out later what to do with the debt that was accumulated. But the Biden administration just continues to want to spend more money, and by and large, it's mostly borrowed money. Somebody someday is going to have to pay that back. So the other thing is that I think that's inflationary, and we've seen the supply chain problems, and what we have is more demand than there is supply, which because of supply chain problems, a lot of them exposed during COVID-19. So that's driving up prices. But we're also seeing that workforce shortages. We're seeing this at the ports in places like Los Angeles, when you've seen all those ships lined up because they don't have the truckers to unload the ships and then to truck the goods to their ultimate destination. So it's a combination of circumstances. But the one thing the federal government can do, at least the legislative branch and executive branch, is quit shoveling money out the door in pursuit of fewer and fewer goods. That's unfortunately a message that the current administration does not seem to understand or willing to accept.
Two other topics I hope to address very quickly, and that is first with regards to COVID-19 funding, which we discussed earlier, you're going to be voting on next week. What does this mean for Texans?
Well, part of the legislation was a bill that passed 100-0 unanimously in the Senate that I worked on with Alex Padilla, a Democrat from California. Because of the fact that we didn't know how long the pandemic would last, we didn't know how much was enough, we just were continuing to try to meet the need. Many cities and many states have a surplus of funds that were designated for COVID that they don't actually need anymore for that purpose, but they're limited by the legislation from the uses to which it can be put. One of the things that Alex and I decided to do is to try to take some of those guardrails off so the money would be spent for long-term productive purposes like building infrastructure and disaster relief. And that is part of the legislation that I believe will pass next week in the Senate, along with repurposing other COVID-19 funds. But thankfully, it looks like thanks to mass vaccination and boostering, as well as the natural immunity that people have gotten from the virus, that the problem is receding, and so the need for that money for that purpose is no longer what it used to be. So that's part of the reason why we're trying, rather than adding to the debt, putting more gasoline on the fire of inflation, using money that's already been appropriated, so it's not new money to meet current needs.
Ukraine, and I saw a poll last week that said people really want to do more to help Ukraine, and yet they don't want to go to war. They don't want American troops to go. So what more do you think can be done to try to stop Russia?
Well, I'm a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, so I'm getting regular reports from our intelligence community about what is actually happening on the ground. But by and large, you're seeing what's happening on the ground right now. Putin is doing very badly. He misjudged. He misjudged the Ukrainian will to fight, and he misjudged President Zelensky, who's been sort of the modern reincarnation of Winston Churchill. It just shows you what an inspired leader and people who have the will to defend their life and their sovereignty, what they're willing to do. So I think the most important thing we have done and will continue to do is provide them the humanitarian assistance they need, because there's a huge refugee crisis that I visited one of the centers in Poland about a month or so ago, and provide them the weapons they need to defend themselves. Unfortunately, Putin is not going to, he's not going to quit, and he continues to grind down cities in Ukraine, to flatten those cities, to kill innocent civilians and commit war crimes. And I'm not sure what the off-ramp or what, how this story ends, but I am encouraged that NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, countries that work with us for common defense in Europe, they understand now what the threat is, and even countries like Germany, who have become captive of Russian oil and gas supplies because they don't have the energy supply diversity, they're beginning to change the way they look at both their own security and our collective security, as well as their dependency on Russian oil and gas. So that's one thing Putin did not expect to do, which he has done. He's energized NATO. He's gotten everybody on guard. He's gotten a lot of help for the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are doing well, relatively speaking, but again, Putin's got the ultimate authority to use weapons of mass destruction that we hope and pray he never uses, and none of us really know for sure exactly how it will end.
Senator John Cornyn, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you.